Santa Fe, lazy in the sun, when we rode into town. Nothing seemed to have changed. Yet there was a feeling of change in me. And Drusilla was here. And this time, I would call at her home. I never called on a girl before. My letter from Drusilla was my own secret, and I had no idea of telling anyone about it. Not even Orrin. When Drusilla wrote, I didn't answer because I couldn't write. And if I'd traced the letters out, well, it didn't seem right that a man should be writing like a child. First off, when we got to Santa Fe, I wanted to see Drusilla, so I went about getting my broadcloth suit brushed and pressed out. It was late afternoon when I rode to the ranch. Miguel was loafing at the gate with a rifle across his knees. Senor, it is good to see you. Every day the senorita has asked me if I have seen you. Is she in? It's good that you're back. Good for them, and good for us, too. He indicated the door. The house surrounded a patio and stood itself within an adobe wall 15 feet high. There was a walk that ran around the inside near the top of the wall, and there were firing positions for at least 30 men on that wall. Don Luis sat working at a desk, and he arose. Good afternoon, senor. It is good to see you. Was your venture a success? So I sat down and told him of our trip. A few of the cattle had carried his brand, and we had kept the money for him, and this I now paid. There is much trouble here, Don Luis said. I fear it is only the beginning. It seemed to me he had aged a lot in the short time since I'd last seen him. And suddenly I realized how much I'd liked that stern, stiff old man with his white mustache. Sitting back in his chair, he told me how Pritz's men made their first move. 40 in the group had moved on some flat land well within the grant and had staked claims there. Then they had dug in for a fight. Knowing the manner of the men he faced, Don Luis held back his vaqueros. There are, senor, many ways to victory, and not all of them through violence. And if there was a pitched battle, some of my men would be hurt, and this I wish to avoid. The invaders were watched, and it was noted when Pritz and Feddersen returned to Santa Fe on business that several bottles appeared, and by midnight half the camp was drunk. Don Luis was close by, but he held back his vaqueros, who were eager for a fight. By 3 a.m, when all were in a drunken sleep, Don Luis's vaqueros moved in swiftly. The invaders were tied to their horses and started back down the road toward Santa Fe. Their tents and equipment were burned or confiscated, their weapons unloaded and returned to them. They were well down the trail when several riders returning from Mora engaged in a running gun battle with the vaqueros. 4 of the invaders were killed, several wounded. Don Luis had 2 men wounded, none seriously. The advantage was ours, Don Luis explained. But Jonathan Pritz is a very shrewd man, and he is making friends. Nor is he a man to suffer defeat without retaliation. It is difficult, he added, to carry out a project with the sort of men he uses. They're toughs and evil men. Don Luis, I said, may I have your permission to see Miss Drusilla? And he arose. Of course, senor. I fear if the privilege were denied, that I would have another war, and one which I am much less suited to handle. We in New Mexico, he added, have been closer to your people than our own. It is far to Mexico City, so our trade has been with you, our customs affected by yours. My family would disapprove of our ways, but the frontier, there is small time for formality. Standing in the living room, most of the lively old Spanish home, I felt stiff in my new clothes. Abilene had given me time to get used to them, but the awkwardness returned now that I was to see Drusilla again. I could hear the click of her heels on the stone flags and turned to face the door, my heart pounding, my mouth suddenly so dry I could scarcely swallow. She paused in the doorway and looking at me. She was taller than I had remembered, and her eyes were larger. And she was beautiful. Too beautiful for a man like me. I thought you had forgotten us, she said. You didn't answer my father. I shifted my hat in my hands. It looked like I'd get here as fast as the letter, and I'm not much hand at writing. An Indian woman came in with some coffee and some little cakes, and we both sat down. Drusilla sat very erect in her chair, her hands in her lap, and I decided she was almost as embarrassed as I was. Ma'am, I never called on a girl before. I guess I'm almighty awkward. Suddenly she giggled. And I've never received a young man before, she said. After that, we didn't have much trouble. We both relaxed, and I told her about our trip and rounding up wild cattle and my fight with the Indians. You must be very brave. Well, now, I liked her thinking that about me, but the fact is, I hadn't thought of much out there but keeping my head and tail down so as not to get shot. And I recall being in something of a sweat to get out of there. I've nothing against a man being scared as long as he does what has to be done. Being scared can keep a man from getting killed and often makes a better fighter of him. We sat there in that cool, spacious room with its dark, massive furniture and tiled floors, and I can tell you, it was a wonderful, friendly feeling. I'd never known a house like that before, and it seemed very grand and very rich. Drew was worried about her grandfather. He's getting old, Tyrel, and I'm afraid for him. He doesn't sleep well, and sometimes he paces the floor all night. Torres was waiting for me when I went to get my horse almost an hour later. Senor, he added carefully, Don Luis likes you, and so does the senorita. And our people, they like you too. He studied me searchingly. Senor Pritz hates us, and he's winning friends among your people. He spends much money. I believe he would take everything from us. Not while I'm alive. We need a sheriff in this country. A man who'll seek justice done. He looked at me. We ask only for justice. What you say is true. We do need a sheriff. Don grows old, and he does not know what to do, but all my life I have been with him. I do not think that to fight is enough. We must do something else, as your people would. There are, Senor, still more Mexicans than Anglos. And believe me, if there was an election, a Mexican sheriff would not be good, Juan. The Americans would not be willing to recognize him. Not those who follow Pritz. This I know, Senor. We'll talk of this again. When I walked into the La Fonda that night, Ollie Shaddock was standing at the bar having a drink. He was a broad man with a shock of blonde hair and a broad, cheerful face. Have a drink, he said. I resigned my sheriffing job to bring your mom and the boys west. You brought Ma? Sure enough, Orrin's with her now. He filled my glass from the bottle. Don't you be thinking of me as sheriff. You done the right thing in killing Long. I'd have had to arrest you, but the law would have freed you. He had a gun pointed when you killed him. We didn't say anything more about it. It was good to have Ollie Shaddock out here, and I owed him a debt for bringing Ma. I wanted to see her the worst way, but Ollie had something on his mind. Folks talk you up pretty high, he said. It's Orrin they like. You know something, Tyrel? I've been giving some thought to Orrin since I got here. He's a man should run for office. It seemed a lot of folks had running for office on their minds. But this was a new country and in need of law. He's got it in mind, I said. I've been in politics all my years. I was a deputy sheriff at 17, sheriff at 19, justice of the peace at 24, and served a term in the state legislature before I was 30. Then I was sheriff again. I know it. Orrin looks to me like a man who could get out the vote. Folks take to him. He talks well, and with a mite more reading, he could make something of himself, if we managed it right. We? Politics ain't much different, Tyrel, than one of those icebergs you hear tell of. Most of what goes on is beneath the surface. It doesn't make any difference how good a man is, or how good his ideas are, or even how honest he is, unless he can put across a program. And that's politics. Statesmanship is about 10% good ideas and motives, and 90% getting backing for your program. Now I figure I know how to get a man elected, and Orrin's our man. Also, you can be a big advantage to him. Folks don't take to me. Now, that as may be, I find out most of the Mexicans like you. They all know you and Orrin turned Pritz down when he invited you to join him. And the vaqueros from the Alvarado Ranch have been talking real friendly about you. He chuckled. Seems the women like you, too. They tell me you provided more entertainment in one afternoon than they had in years. Now look, I can feel myself getting red around the ears. Don't let it bother you. Folks enjoyed it. They like you. Don't ask me why. You seem to learn a lot since you've been here. Every man to his job. Mine's politics. First thing is to listen. Learn the issues, the personalities, where the votes are, where the hard feelings are. Ollie Shaddock tasted his whiskey and put the glass back on the bar. Tyrel, there's trouble brewing, and it will come from the Pritz outfit. That's a rough bunch of boys, and they'll get to drinking, and then they'll be killing. Chances are it'll be a riot or something like that. So we got to go up there, you and me and Orrin. And when the trouble comes, Orrin has to handle it. He's no officer. Leave that to me. When it happens, folks will want somebody to take over the responsibility. So Orrin steps in. He tossed the whiskey. Look, Pritz wants Torres killed. Some of the other key men. When the shooting starts, some of those fur thieves and rustlers he's got will go too far. Orrin steps in. He's Anglo, so all the better Americans will be for him. You convince the Mexicans Orrin is their man. Then we get Orrin appointed marshal, run him for sheriff, and start planning for the legislature. Ollie made a lot of sense. And it beat all how quickly he'd gotten hold of the situation. And him here only a few weeks. Orrin was the man for it, all right. Or Tom Sunday. What about Tom Sunday? He figures he's the man for the job, but Tom Sunday can't talk to folks like Orrin can. He can't get down and be friends with everybody the way Orrin can. Orrin he just plain likes people, and they feel it. Like you and the Mexicans. And they know it. He added, Orrin is one of ours. And one thing about Orrin, we don't have to lie. Would you lie? Ollie was embarrassed. Tyrel, politics. And in politics, a man wants to win. So he hedges a little. Whatever we do has to be honest, I said. Look, I'm no pilgrim, but there's nothing to this world I can't get without lying or cheating. Ma raised us boys that ways, and I'm glad of it. All right. Honesty is a good policy, and a man's honest, he gets around. Now, what do you think about Orrin? I think he's the right man. Only, as I left there and started to see Ma, I was thinking about Tom Sunday. Tom was our friend, and Tom wasn't going to like this. He was a mite jealous of Orrin. Tom had the best education, but folks, they just paid more mind to Orrin. Ma had aged. She was settling in her old rocker, which Ollie had brought west in his wagon, and she had that old shawl over her knees. When I walked in, she was puffing on that old pipe, and she looked me up and down, mighty sharp. You filled out. Your pa would be proud of you. So we sat there and talked about the mountains back home and of the folks we knew, and I told her some of our plans, thinking how hard her years had been, and I wanted to do something for her and the boys. Bob was 17, and Joe was 15. Ma wasn't used to much, but she liked flowers around her and trees. She liked meadow grass blowing in the wind and the soft fall of rain on her own roof. A good fire, her rocker, a home of her own, and her boys not too far away. Ollie Shaddock wasted no time but rode off toward Mora. He was planning on buying a place, a saloon or some such place where folks could get together. In those days, a saloon was a meeting place, and usually the only one. Of the books I'd bought, I'd read Marcy's guidebooks first, and then that story, The Deer Slayer. That was a sure good enough story, too. Then I read Washington Irving's book about traveling on the prairies, and now was reading Greg on Commerce of the Prairies. Reading those books was making me talk better and look around more and see what Irving had seen, or Greg, and it was mighty interesting. Orrin and me headed for the hills to scout a place for a home. Sate was feeling his oats and gave me a lively go-round, but I figured the trip would take some of the salt out of him. That Satan horse really did like to hump his back and duck his head between his legs. We rode along, talking land, cattle, and politics, and enjoying the day. This was a far cry from those blue-green Tennessee mountains, but the air was so clear you could hardly believe it, and I'd never seen a more beautiful land. The mountains were close above us, sharp and clear against the sky, and mostly covered with pines. Sate wasn't cutting up anymore. He was stepping right out like he wanted to go somewhere, but pretty soon I began to get a feeling I didn't like very much. Sometimes a man's senses will pick up sounds or glimpses not strong enough to make an impression on him, but they affect his thinking anyway. Maybe that's all there is to instinct or the awareness a man develops when he's in dangerous country. But one thing I do know, his senses become tuned to sounds above him and below the usual ranges of hearing. We caught, of a sudden, a faint smell of dust on the air. There was no wind, but there was dust. We walked our horses forward, and I watched Sate's ears, and those ears picked up, like the Mustang he was. and I knew he was aware of something himself. My eyes caught an impression, and I walked my horse over for a look where part of the bark was peeled away from a branch. There were horses and tracks on the ground around the bush. Horse tracks. 3 or 4, wouldn't you say, Tyrel? 5. This one is different. The horses must have stood there about 2 hours. And then the 5th one came up, but he didn't step down. He didn't stop. Several cigarette butts were under a tree near where the horses had been tethered, and the stub of a black cigar. We were already further north than we had planned to go, and suddenly it came to me. Orrin, we're on the Alvarado Grant. He looked around, studied our back trail, and he said, I think it's Taurus. Somebody is laying for him. He walked his horse along, studying the tracks. One of the horses had small feet, a light, almost prancing step. We both knew that track. A man who can read sign can read a track the way a banker would a signature. That small hoof and light step, and that sideline way of moving was Reed Carney's show horse. Whoever the others had been, and the chances were Reed Carney had joined up with Feddersen and Pritz. They had waited there until the 5th man came along to get them. And that meant he could have been a lookout watching for the man they were to kill. Now, we were assuming a good deal, maybe, but there was nothing to bring a party up here. Not in those days. Orrin shucked his Winchester. It was pine timber now, and the trail angled up the slope through the trees. When we stopped again, we were high up in the air. It was so clear you could see for miles. The rim was not far ahead. We saw them. 4 riders, and below on the slope, a 5th one, scouting. And far across the valley floor, a plume of dust that looked like it must be the one who was to be the target. The men were below us, taking up positions to cover a place not 60 yards from their rifles. They were 100 feet or so higher than the rider, and he would be in the open. Orrin and me left our horses in the trees. We stood on the edge of the mesa with a straight drop of about 70 feet right ahead of us. Then the talus sloped away steeply to where the 5 men had gathered after leaving their horses tied to the brush a good 100 yards off. They were well concealed from below. There was no escape for them, however, to the right or to the left. They could not come up the hill, and they could not go over the rim. Orrin found himself in a nice spot behind a wedged-up slab of rock. Me, I was sizing up a big boulder and getting an idea. The boulder sat right on the edge of the mesa, and in fact, it was part of the edge that was ready to fall with a little help. I like to roll rocks. Sure, it's crazy, but I like to see them roll and bounce and take a lot of debris with them. So I walked to the rim and braced myself against the trunk of a gnarled old cedar, and I put my feet against the edge of that rock. The rider they were waiting for was almost in sight. When I put my boots against that rock, my knees had to be doubled up, so I began to push. I began to straighten them out, and the rock crunched heavily and teetered slightly, and then, with a slow, majestic movement, it turned over and fell. The huge boulder hit with a heavy thud and turned over and gained speed and rolled down the hill, and the riders glanced around and seemed unable to move. And then, as that boulder turned over and started to fall, they scattered like sheep. At the same instant, Orrin lifted his rifle and put a bullet into the brush ahead of the horses. One of the broncs reared up, and as Orrin fired again, he jerked his head and, ripping off a branch of the brush, broke free and started to run, holding his head to one side to keep from tripping on the branch. The lone horseman had come into sight, and when he stared up the mountain, I lifted my hat and waved, knowing from his fawn-colored sombrero that it was Taurus. Doubtfully, he lifted a hand, unable to make us out at that distance. One of the men started for their horses, and Orrin put a bullet in the ground ahead of him, and the man dove for shelter. Orrin levered another shot into the rocks where he disappeared, and then sat back and lighted up one of those Spanish cigars. It was downright hot. Settling in behind some rocks, I took a pull at my canteen and figured down where they were, and it was hotter than up here, where we had some shade. I figured if those men have to walk home, Orrin said, it might cool their tempers some. A slow half hour passed before one of the men down below got ambitions. My rifle put a bullet so close it must have singed his whiskers, and he hunkered down in the rocks. Funny part of it was, we could see them plain as day. Had we wanted to kill them, we could have. And then we heard a horse coming through the trees, and I walked back to meet Taurus. What's happening? He looked sharply from Orrin to me. Looks like you were expected. Orrin and me were hunting a place for ourselves, and we found some tracks. And when we followed them up, there were 5 men down there. I showed him where. Then I explained our idea about the horses, and he agreed. It will be for me to do. He went off down the slope, and after a while, I saw him come out of the trees, untie the horses, and run them off. When Taurus rode back, Orrin came up to join us. "It is much you have done for me," Taurus said. "I shall not forget." "It is nothing," I said. "One of them is Reed Carney." "Gracias, Sackett," Taurus said. I believed I was safe so far from the hacienda, but man is safe nowhere. Riding back toward Mora, I kept still and let Orrin and Taurus get acquainted. Taurus was a solid man, and I knew Orrin would like him, and Taurus liked people, so the contrary was true as well. Taurus turned off toward the ranch, and we rode on into Mora. We got down in front of the saloon and strolled inside. It took one glance to see we were not among friends. For one thing, there wasn't a Mexican in the place, and this was mostly a Mexican town. And there were faces I remembered from Pawnee Rock. We found a place at the bar and ordered drinks. There must have been 40 men in that saloon. A dusty, dirty lot, most of them with uncut hair over their collars, and loaded down with 6-shooters and Bowie knives. Fedderson was at the other end of the bar, but hadn't seen us. We finished our drinks and edged toward the door, and then we came face to face with Red, the one my horse had knocked down at Pawnee Rock. He started to open his mouth, but before he could say a word, Orrin clapped him on the shoulder. "Red! You old sidewinder! Come on outside and let's talk." Now, Red was a slow-thinking man, and he blinked a couple of times, trying to decide what Orrin was talking about. And we had him outside before he could yell, and he started to yell, but Orrin whooped with laughter and slapped Red on the back so hard it knocked all the breath out of him. Outside the door, I put my knife against his ribs, and he lost all impulse to yell. And I mean, he steadied down some. "Now wait a minute," he protested. "I never done you boys any harm. I was just..." "You just walk steady," I told him. "I'm not in the mood for any trouble. I got a backache, and I don't feel up to a shooting, so don't push me." "Who's pushing?" Red, Orrin said seriously, you're the kind of man we like to see. Handsome, upstanding, and alive. Alive, I added. But you'd make a handsome corpse, Red. By now, we had him out in the dark and away from his friends, and he was scared. His eyes as big as dollars. He looked like a tree coin in the lamplight. What are you going to do to me? He protested. Look, Red, Orrin said, there's a fair land up north, a wide and beautiful land, and it's a land with running cedar, clear streams, and grass hip-high to a tall elk. I tell you, Red, that's a country. And you know something, Red? I put in my 2 bits. We think you should see it. We surely do. Orrin was dead serious. We're going to miss you if you go, Red, but Red, you stay and we won't miss you. You got a horse, Red? Yeah, sure. He was looking from one side to the other of us. Sure, I got a horse. You'll like the country up north. Now, it can get too hot here for a man, Red. And the atmosphere is heavy. There's lead in it. And you know, we're liable to be. We think you should get a straddle of that cayuse of yours, Red, and keep riding until you get to Pikes Peak or maybe Montana. Tonight? He protested. Of course. All your life you've wanted to see that country up north, Red, and you just can't wait. I got to get my outfit. Don't do it, Red. Orrin shook his head, big-eyed. Don't do it. He leaned closer. Vigilantes, Red. Vigilantes. Red jerked under my hand, and he wet his lips with his tongue. Now look here, he protested. The climate's bad here, Red. A man's been known to die from it. Why, I know men that bet you wouldn't live to see daybreak. We came to a nice little gray. This your horse? He nodded. You get right up in the saddle, Red. No, keep your gun. If somebody should decide to shoot you, they'd want you to have your gun on to make it look right. Looks bad to shoot an unarmed man. Now, don't you feel like traveling, Red? By this time, Red may have been figuring things out, or maybe he never even got started. Anyway, he turned his horse into the street, and he went out of town at a fast canter. Orrin looked at me and grinned. Now there's a traveling man. He looked more serious. I never thought we'd get out of there without a shooting. That bunch was drinking, and they would have loved to lynch a couple of us, or shoot us. We rode back to join Cap and Tom Sunday. About time. Tom's been afraid he'd have to go down and pull you out from under some settlement men, Cap said. What do you mean, settlement men? Jonathan Pritz has organized a company which calls the Settlement Company. You can buy shares. If you don't have money, you can buy them with a gun. Orrin had nothing to say. He never did when Pritz's name was mentioned. He just sat down on his bed and pulled off a boot. You know, he said reflectively, all that talk about the country up north convinced me. I think we should all go.